They rarely say it to your face, but there's a subtle consensus pulsing underneath society's surface. If you haven't made it by your early 30s or 40s, you've probably missed your chance. People call it pragmatism. To you, it feels like a quiet judgment, one that sinks in until you start to believe it. You see the headlines, the feeds, the promotions of people years younger than you, getting noticed, cashing in, cementing their reputations. And somewhere deep inside, a question starts looping. Is my moment gone for good? You don't voice it, but it hums in the background every time someone asks, "So, what are you up to now?" It shows up in those small pauses when you compare where you are to where you thought you'd be. It's a soft accusation, not shouted, but constant. I should have had this figured out by now. What if that conclusion is wrong? What if you haven't been falling behind at all? What if the last 10 or 20 years have been less about delay and more about groundwork? The truth no one puts on billboards is that the flames that burn the steadiest are the ones that took the longest to catch. Early wins can be dazzling, but they're often built for speed, not longevity. While others were chasing applause, you were stockpiling the things that can't be faked: tenacity, deeper perspective, an instinct for spotting patterns, and the rare comfort of moving without constant noise. Our culture loves youth because it's loud, but the real revolutions? They're often crafted by late bloomers, working with intent, moving without spectacle, and changing the landscape permanently. You're not behind schedule. You're still in the making. And when you finally step forward, you won't be sprinting after approval. You'll be anchoring a legacy. The detour may have been the design all along. You weren't meant to rise when you were still fragile. You were meant to rise once your roots could hold the weight. The world keeps time by clocks, but clocks can't track readiness. So if you've looked at yourself and thought, "Something in me still hasn't started yet," that's your signal. Your arrival is still ahead. There's an idea so ingrained we almost never challenge it. It doesn't bark orders. It seeps into the background. It says, "You should have the plan sorted by now. You're too old to start fresh. The chance you missed won't come back." It's echoed at family gatherings in offhand comments. It's in the eyebrow raise when someone says, "Oh, he's still doing that?" It's in the unspoken rules of hiring managers, the limited roles older actors are given, the tech world's fixation on barely out-of-college founders. The message is simple. If you didn't lock in success by a certain age, you're already lagging. If you're past 40 and still experimenting, still learning, still daring, the world doesn't always frame that as resilience. It calls it naive. But think, who decided that the best years of your life had to happen before your brain even finishes maturing? This isn't a biological law. It's a story we bought into when we were too young to see the trap. When you're young, you mistake acceleration for achievement. You think being in the spotlight means you've already arrived. That hype equals depth. That missing a narrow window means missing everything. So you run, not always towards something real, but to avoid the shame of being last. That's not progress. That's fear in disguise. Here's the sharper truth. You didn't fail. You were taught the wrong measure. You were told speed was the only metric worth tracking. And you heard it so many times, it became part of your mental operating system. Napoleon Hill named this the law of cosmic habit force, the phenomenon where a thought, repeated enough, sets like cement in your subconscious. The whisper that says, "It's too late," isn't truth. It's leftover code. And like any code, it can be rewritten. Youth has its strengths, energy, boldness, but also its vulnerabilities. Inexperience, a self-image that shifts with other people's opinions, and a reliance on recognition to feel legitimate. Many fast successes are built like houses without foundations, impressive facades, vulnerable to the first hard storm. Late bloomers? They've weathered storms already. They've survived invisibility and learned to move without a cheering crowd. They don't need to win fast. They need to win in a way that lasts. Maybe you've taken longer. Maybe you've wrestled with doubt. But you're still here, and that matters. The only thing you have to dismantle is the artificial deadline you were handed. Once you walk away from it, you'll see it clearly. You're not late. You're just not reading from someone else's schedule anymore. That's where real freedom starts. With time, certain abilities sharpen in ways nothing else can match. Number 1, clearer pattern recognition. You've lived through enough cycles to see warning signs and opportunities before they're obvious to others. Number 2, resilience tempered in fire. First rejections can break the untested. You've been turned away before and found your way back stronger. Number 3, clarity over ego. You're not out to prove you can do something. You're focused on doing what matters. Carl Jung described this as individuation, the process of becoming whole, where the person you present to the world and the person you are inside finally align. In your 20s, you're still wearing costumes you were handed. With age, the seams split, and through the cracks, your real self starts to step forward. Colonel Sanders was 65 years old when he launched KFC, after failing at multiple careers, from running a service station to practicing law. Vera Wang didn't design her first gown until 40, after years in other industries. They didn't succeed late. They succeeded when they were truly prepared. And then there's Antonio. For decades, he was the go-to plumber only when others weren't available. He wasn't ignored because of age. He was overlooked because he was invisible. Then came the morning he asked himself, if fear wasn't running the show, how would I step into the day? From that moment, he stopped describing himself as just a plumber and began positioning himself as a leak prevention strategist. He refined his appearance, increased his rates, and began sharing short, valuable insights about water damage online. For months, it felt like shouting into the void, then momentum. 6 months later, his schedule was full, his team was growing, and more importantly, his story was his own again. The battles we think we're fighting are almost always external. Money, timing, opportunity, connections. But the real conflict lives in here, in the constant script you run on autopilot. It sounds harmless, like, I'm too old for that now. That's just not realistic at this stage. If I had started earlier, maybe. Those aren't harmless thoughts. They're micro-assassinations aimed directly at your own potential. And because they don't arrive with warning sirens, you accept them as logic. The mind is not your enemy, but it will obey the loudest and most familiar voice, unless you train it otherwise. Your subconscious doesn't check IDs. It doesn't ask if a belief is true. It simply takes the repetition as reality. That's why so many people live the same year over and over, thinking it's life, when in reality, it's just unchallenged programming. Napoleon Hill explained a concept called autosuggestion, that any idea, plan, or intention, repeated enough, is planted in the subconscious as law. The majority of us have been running this process, but instead of seeding it with ambition or possibility, we've fed it with limits. I've never been good with money. I've always been shy. I'm just not a risk taker. We've been rehearsing a smaller identity for decades, longer than we've practiced the one we actually want. When you start speaking a new identity into existence, it will feel awkward, maybe even fake. That's not delusion, that's unfamiliarity. Say, I'm prepared, I'm wise, I'm exactly on time. The old voice will scoff. Good. That's the sign you've stepped out of your loop. The first steps of building a stronger belief system aren't about convincing the world. They're about outlasting the resistance inside yourself. And over time, the old voice tires. It stops arguing.
That's when the shift begins, not with fireworks, but with quiet, consistent action. One morning, you get up when you don't feel like it. One decision to say no to what drains you. One uncomfortable yes to something that might grow you. And then, almost without noticing, you hear your inner dialogue speaking differently. Not mocking, but echoing back the person you've been becoming all along. But there's a trap here. You can rewire your beliefs in the morning and undo them by nightfall if you keep returning to environments that reinforce the old script. The danger is that toxic environments rarely look toxic. They often feel warm, familiar. They're the friend groups that turn every conversation toward limitation. The family member who, without malice, tells you it's too risky to try at your age. These aren't just opinions, they're viral ideas, softly spoken until they root in your identity. You don't become stuck overnight. You absorb it drop by drop, phrase by phrase. This is why Napoleon Hill said, you become the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with, not just in wealth, but in mindset, energy, and vision. If you constantly hear scarcity, fear, and nostalgia, those seeds will grow whether you want them to or not. Think of a single drop of water hitting the same spot of stone for years. One drop is nothing, but repeated endlessly, it carves the rock. That's what your surroundings do to you, shape your edges until you match them. You don't have to exile everyone from your life. You don't need to move to the mountains and live alone, but you do need to protect your mental soil. That means choosing the conversations you entertain, the energy you allowed to take root, the rooms where your ideas are either nourished or quietly starved. It's not cruelty, it's survival. If you're finally clearing the debris from your own identity, you can't afford to let someone else's decay settle in your space. Boundaries aren't about shutting people out, they're about keeping your growth intact. That might mean leaving some calls unanswered. It might mean changing the subject when someone speaks limitation into your vision. And yes, it might mean creating distance from people you still love. Here's the one that catches people off guard: nostalgia. It doesn't feel dangerous, it feels comforting. But often it's a tether to a version of yourself you've already outgrown. You flip through old photos, listen to songs from back then, replay the stories of who you used to be. And what you're missing isn't always the past. It's the version of yourself who hadn't been tested yet. The one who could throw themselves into something without shame or hesitation. But was that version truly better, or just less aware? Was that era really golden, Or are you simply frustrated enough now to imagine that it was? There's also the ghost version of yourself, the one who should have succeeded by 28, who would have been further along if they hadn't stumbled. That person never existed. They were a projection built from other people's expectations. Clinging to that ghost is sabotage. As long as you hold on to who you think you should have been, you block who you could still become. Carl Jung called this the death of the persona, the mask we wear to survive the early stages of life. That mask may have helped you get here, but it won't take you where you're going next. Letting it go feels like betrayal. In truth, it's liberation. It's saying, thank you for getting me this far, but I can't be you anymore. That's the work. Closing the album, putting down the old playlist, and stepping forward into an identity you haven't fully met yet. Every major transformation has a moment almost no one talks about. It isn't glamorous. It doesn't photograph well. It's the point where you've let go of who you used to be, but haven't yet stepped into who you're becoming. It's a limbo, a stretch of time with no clear titles, no obvious wins, no applause. The old dreams don't fit, but the new ones aren't formed enough to carry you yet. The people who knew the old you don't quite understand you anymore, and your future allies haven't appeared. This is where most people quit, not because they lack courage, but because they mistake being undefined for being lost. But you're not lost. You're being rewritten. Think of a seed buried underground. No sunlight, no validation, no outward movement. But beneath the surface, roots are weaving themselves deep into the soil. Structure is forming. The very shape of life is being set in motion. That's what this quiet middle is, the unseen engineering of your next chapter. Even in the stillness, comparison will try to pull you sideways. You'll scroll and see the ones rising fast, the old friends with their polished updates, the people who seem further ahead. The voice will whisper, "Why is it taking me so long?" Here's the truth. They're not ahead. They're just visible. Loudness isn't depth. Noise isn't wisdom. And momentum built without roots rarely survives its first storm. Look at history. The people who reshaped the world often disappeared before they returned. They were mocked, overlooked, written off, and then came back unrecognizable. That's the pattern. If you can stand the silence, if you can resist the pull to announce, to prove, to explain, you'll re-emerge different, the kind of different that can't be undone. You'll walk into rooms that once ignored you and shift the atmosphere without saying a word. We live in a world drowning in speed, obsessed with optics, more output, more content, more "look at me." But the question almost no one stops to ask is, build what and why? That's why the world needs late bloomers, not just to succeed, but to recalibrate what success means. Late bloomers don't move to impress. They move because they've seen what matters. They've already lived through setbacks, survived the invisibility stage, and learned to operate without applause. Their drive doesn't scream. It smolders with conviction. And conviction builds things that noise never can. Things that last. We're entering a moment in history where style without substance collapses fast, where speed without structure is a liability. People are beginning to crave wisdom, not just ideas, but insight, not just motivation, but maturity. That's the natural ground of the late bloomer, because wisdom can't be rushed. It's the product of reflection, reinvention, and resistance. The late bloomer isn't competing for attention anymore. They're shaping direction. They don't need to raise their voice to be heard. They lower the volume in the room so that when they speak, people lean in. Early success often comes from the need to prove something. Late success comes from the desire to offer something. That shift is where legacy begins. Because legacy doesn't care if it's trending, only if it's timeless. You're not late, you're distilled. You're not old, you're initiated. The fire that takes longer to light burns hotter, cleaner, and longer. And in a distracted, restless world, that kind of fire is irreplaceable. This isn't about catching up to anyone else's pace. It's about redefining the standard altogether. And that won't happen in front of an audience. There will be no grand opening, no viral moment announcing your arrival. The work will begin in silence, brick by brick, belief by belief, until the shape of your life changes.
It will feel lonely, not because you're forgotten, but because the people around you don't yet recognize the person you're becoming. That's how it should be. Transformation starts as disappearance before it looks like emergence. Time is not your enemy. Comfort is. Comfort keeps you circling the same patterns, replaying the same conversations, apologizing for wanting more. Comfort locks you into a life designed by someone else's rules. Coherence is the opposite. It's when the inside finally matches the outside. When you stop talking about who you're going to be because you've already started walking it. So if you're off the radar right now, if no one sees the work you're doing, good. Let the silence sharpen you. Let the pressure build strength. Let the inner work happen without witnesses. Because when you come back, it won't be to pick up where you left off. It will be to arrive as someone so transformed that even you don't recognize the person you were before. Your story doesn't fade in obscurity, it begins there. That's the secret no one told you. Now you know. Which means when you return, it won't be optional for the world to notice. It will be impossible for them to ignore.